At the height of its popularity in the late 1980s, the Rottweiler was one of the most registered breeds in Britain, America, and across much of Western Europe. Within a decade, it had been banned outright in several countries, subjected to breed-specific legislation on 4 continents, and reduced in the popular imagination to a symbol of danger so deeply embedded in culture that the mere sight of one was enough to clear a pavement. This happened not because the dog had changed, but because social anxiety, irresponsible ownership, and media appetite for a simple villain produced one of the most damaging breed panics in the history of the domestic dog. The Rottweiler did not become the world's most feared breed. It was made into one. The Rottweiler spent nearly 2,000 years as one of Europe's most trusted working animals. A cattle drover's dog in medieval Germany, a police dog from the early 1900s onwards, a military asset in both world wars, and by the 1970s, a breed growing steadily in popularity across the Western world as serious handlers on both sides of the Atlantic recognized what European working dog traditions had long understood. The breed's entire identity had been built around a specific quality: the capacity to be powerful without being dangerous, to discriminate between a genuine threat and a non-threat, to protect what needed protecting, and stand down when the situation required nothing at all. That was the animal that entered the 1980s as one of the world's most respected working breeds. What emerged from the other side of that decade bore almost no resemblance to it. Not because the dog had changed, but because the world's media had decided what it was, and the world's legislators had followed. The conditions that turned the Rottweiler into a tabloid villain were not unique to any single country. They were a product of the 1980s itself, a decade defined across the Western world by urban anxiety and a popular press in permanent competition for the most visceral story available. In Britain, the breakpoint came in 1989 when a Rottweiler attacked 5-year-old Ruxana Khan in Bradford. The tabloid response was immediate and template-setting. The Sun packaged the story not as an incident involving a specific poorly managed animal, but as confirmation of what Rottweilers categorically were, deploying language like devil dog, 4-legged time bomb, and born to kill that would be recycled across the British press for years with remarkable consistency. The individual circumstances of the attack, including reports that the dog had been regularly left unsupervised and poorly controlled, were either buried or omitted entirely. In the United States, the panic followed a parallel trajectory, driven less by a single incident than by an accumulating body of coverage that treated every Rottweiler attack as confirmation of a breed characteristic rather than a failure of individual ownership. The breed had become the second most popular in America by the mid-1990s, and visibility in a media environment primed to report attacks in a specific way functioned as accelerant. Dozens of municipalities moved to restrict or ban Rottweilers outright, the breed becoming almost interchangeable in the public imagination, pit bull types as a symbol of urban menace. In Australia, Queensland and Western Australia both placed Rottweilers on restricted breed lists that imposed conditions onerous enough to make the breed effectively unmarketable to the average family. In Brazil, a series of high-profile attacks in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro in the mid-1990s produced exactly the same cycle of tabloid amplification, political response, and reputational collapse that had already played out in the Northern Hemisphere. What is striking across all of these national versions of the same story is how little the local specifics mattered. The breed, the media mechanism, and the political response were essentially identical, regardless of whether the dateline was Birmingham or Brisbane, New York, or São Paulo. The Rottweiler panic was not a British phenomenon or an American one. It was a template running wherever the conditions of late 20th century media culture existed to support it. Across every country where the panic took hold, the political response followed identical logic. Legislators who had allowed tabloid coverage to define the problem were now required to be seen solving it, and breed-specific legislation was the most visible solution available regardless of whether evidence supported it. Britain's Dangerous Dogs Act of 1991 was the most notorious example, widely described even by politicians who voted for it as legislation written by newspaper editors, rushed through Parliament and banning 4 breed types outright. Germany, in a development carrying particular historical irony given the breed's origins, saw multiple federal states introduce Rottweiler-specific restrictions in the late 1990s, with Bavaria and Hesse classifying the breed as dangerous and imposing licensing requirements and mandatory insurance. The Netherlands banned the breed entirely in 1993, a prohibition that remained for over a decade before being lifted in 2008, following evidence it had produced no measurable reduction in bite incidents. Several Latin American countries introduced national-level bans during the same period, with the Rottweiler appearing almost universally alongside pit bull types as a primary target. The consistent failure of these measures, study after study across multiple countries, finding that breed-specific legislation did not reduce dog bite rates, did almost nothing to slow the legislative momentum, because the legislation had never really been about bite statistics. It had been about the appearance of action in response to a media-constructed emergency. The damage the global panic inflicted operated through the same mechanism everywhere, destroying responsible ownership culture around the breed while simultaneously advertising it to exactly the wrong audience. In the United States, AKC Rottweiler registrations peaked at over 100,000 annually in the mid-1990s, before collapsing to a fraction of that figure by the 2000s. In Britain, Kennel Club registrations fell by over 75% from the late 1980s peak. Responsible breeders, people who had spent years selecting for the stable working temperament the breed had historically been known for, found their waiting lists evaporating, replaced by demand from people drawn to the breed specifically because of the tabloid reputation. The working dog world largely insulated itself and continued producing exceptional animals throughout, but the broader domestic population was reshaped by 15 years of irresponsible breeding into a genuinely less stable population. Panic had manufactured the very problem it claimed to be responding to. There is a question that tabloid coverage across every country never once asked. If the Rottweiler was inherently dangerous, why had every serious working dog tradition in the Western world spent a century selecting it for exactly the opposite quality? German police trusted these dogs where temperamental instability cost lives. The breed's identity was built around power paired with restraint, capability paired with discrimination. What made Rottweilers dangerous across the world in the late 1980s and 1990s was the collision between what the dog genuinely was and what a generation of new owners, guided by tabloid mythology rather than understanding, imagined it to be: a working animal with profound needs for structure and purpose, placed into environments providing neither and blamed entirely when the consequences followed. The media found that situation in country after country and stripped out every layer of complexity, because complexity does not travel well across a front page, and nuance has never once sold a newspaper in any language. The Rottweiler wasn't cast as the world's most dangerous dog because of anything it actually was. It was cast because the story needed a villain. And once that casting decision was made, in newsrooms from London to Sydney to Sao Paulo, it proved nearly impossible to undo. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe and suggest any ideas for future videos on your favorite dogs. See you soon!